An invitation to somebody?
Maybe. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Legal Tech Week, where we're still waiting for some panelists who are supposed to be here to join us, so hopefully they will do that. But today is May 15th, 2026. I'm Bob Ambrogi, and this is a show where we talk about the latest news in legal tech and innovation, and it was a pretty busy week, so there's a lot to talk about. Well, especially if some of our panelists join us, there'll be more to talk about. But in the meantime, we can kind of start with introductions anyway, and then get on with it. So, Joe, you want to kick it off?
Sure. Joe Patrice from Above the Law, and I have a podcast called Thinking Like a Lawyer, and I am here having not written anything really about tech, so I'm relying on the rest of the panel being here, which is good. We'll see if people shall.
We'll see. I might be the only person here who actually wrote anything about tech this week. Um, Steve, how about you? Who the heck are you, Steve?
Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Embry. I write the blog Tech Law Crossroads. I also write for
There we go.
Above the Law. And I did write about tech this week, but not stories that were about Claude. I was at the Clock Conference, so I've had some stuff on that, but I don't have anything to offer on Claude, at least written.
Okay. And making a momentary appearance was still there. She is.
Sorry, technical
A cameo
difficulty.
appearance by Stephanie Wilkins.
Technical
Stephanie and Victor
difficulty
must have
on
been
our
at the
tech
same
show.
party.
Yes. Oh, is it? Are we up to me?
Yeah,
Hi.
you're up. You're up.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Stephanie Wilkins. I am the director of content at Legal Tech Hub. Sorry to be a couple of minutes late, but I'm excited to be here.
All right. And Victor. Victor. Can't hear
We're nailing it on the tech today.
you. You know, it's funny because it's been like this week of like I've had more tech mishaps this week. I
Oh
had
no, sorry.
several. Oh, there
Sorry.
you are.
Yeah, this thing has a red thing that I didn't see. So sorry about that.
This thing is a red thing. Okay.
Yeah, there's like a little red button that I forgot to press to unmute myself. So sorry about
Oh,
that.
okay. Okay. All
My
right.
name is Victor Lee. I'm assistant managing editor for the ABA Journal, covering business and technology and stuff. And now we're going to talk about tech. So makes sense that I would be unprepared to talk about that.
Absolutely. Good. Good. Well, we've reassured the audience that we are fully prepared to discuss the week's news. Oh, wow.
Oh,
Really? What the heck are you doing here so early?
I know, I'm right on time. It's Claudapalooza or Claudnado. What did we land on the
I
Claude?
don't think we've figured that out yet.
But I do like Claude NATO. That's nice.
Yeah, I think it's
All right.
Claude Ghazi.
What was yours, Stephanie? Yours
I
was
was Claude's Legal Palooza. Claude Legal
Claude.
Palooza.
All right. So, Julie, you got here just in time to introduce yourself. We were just still doing introductions.
Wow, I am early. Hi, I'm
You
Julie
are.
Shafali. I'm in Canada. I write about legal tech for the Canadian Bar Association, the Walrus, which is a version of the Newsweek, but with a cooler name, and other publications. Good to see you all.
All right. Kind of like that Clauderific, Nancy from Merlin. That's a good one.
Claude around.
All right. Well, it is the Claude apocalypse this week, and that is obviously the biggest story to talk about, I think, this week, and probably one of the main stories some of us wrote about. I know Stephanie and I wrote about it. Joe has already said he didn't get a chance to write about it. Steve was at Clock. He didn't get a chance to write about it. Victor, I don't know if you guys covered it at all, but
I
I'm
did.
sure we all have
I wrote
thoughts.
something brief about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we've all heard the news right now, but I don't know, Stephanie. I mean, you were right on top of this. You had a really in-depth story right up as the news came out, and as well as a kind of a timeline of Claude's creep into the legal world. Do you want to kind of give us some background and your take on it all?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'll put the articles in the chat, but I was writing an article which turned into like a magnum opus on Claude for legal. And as part of it, I was pulling together a timeline. So I just broke it out into his whole separate article because I was pushing thousands and thousands of words. But yeah, I think and the reason I included the timeline is that this feels sort of sudden. Like everyone started really, I mean, by everyone, I mean like the general universe, not necessarily the super legal tech nerds. Um, Kind of has been thinking of Anthropic as a newer entrant in legal. You know, they came out with that legal plugin in I think it was like late January that tanked the markets, and it seemed like this whole brand new thing. But if I started looking back, I honestly hadn't realized, like, we all remember the day GPT-4 came out, and that's when CoCounsel had it. It's literally the same day that Claude launched at all. I had missed
Hmm.
that connection. But even in their just general Claude launch, um, they even cited Robin AI, which, you know, at the time was a big legal AI player, and they were, you know, that was one of their sort of use cases. And then people started incorporating it as they went multi-model. And there really just was a lot more evidence that this has been a slow, to you, if I were AI, I would say they were quietly rolling through legal for the last 3 years. But it really has always been there. And so, I mean, the writing seemed to be on the wall starting February, but it really kind of was there a lot longer. And so we went really quickly from that first legal plugin to now there's 12 practice area specific plugins, and there's these 20 plus MCP connectors, which, you know, we started at the beginning of the year talking about how big of a deal MCP was going to be for legal, and I think this really bears that out. And so it's really it's a huge push. It's similar to what they've done they have Claude for financial services and a few other verticals. Um, they they're very clear and obviously take anything with a grain of salt, but their messaging currently is that they are not looking to replace anybody. They want to, you know, rising tide lifts all boats, like make the pie bigger for everyone, let lawyers work where or still allow, you know, lawyers to work where they always work. And so, I mean, it's interesting. And I mean, like I said, obviously take anything with a grain of salt. We'll see how that plays out. But I think it's, you know, there's a it's a who's who of legal tech players that are listed in the MCP connector list. I mean, there are some obvious people missing, I'd say, but because there aren't a lot of competitors. There seems to be sort of one-offs between a lot of the big categories. Um, but I mean, I think it's a smart play because, you know, as these foundational models get stronger and these generalist platforms get stronger, I mean, there's always been this question of what is the moat for legal tech, and it's becoming smaller and smaller. So it sort of is like do you play along with it, or do you, you know, fight it and then be replaced? Is kind of my unofficial view on that. I haven't really worked through that part yet. But there's also a huge access to justice angle to this. I mean, because they have A2J partners, they have connectors with some, you know, more public service oriented or lower cost tools. That is amazing. And I'm annoyed with myself because I wanted to have published it by now, but it's not done. I'm doing a whole article that is breaking down the legal research aspect of it and the capabilities. And I do think, you know, there's huge A2J potential there. Yeah, there's so much to talk about, and I agree that A2J requires its own separate discussion of this, but it really is like, it remains to be seen how it plays out, but this is definitely not nothing. I think it is significant, and it's not a replacement for anything at the moment, but we're definitely getting there. I don't know. What did everyone else think of it? There's so much to synthesize. I felt like, you know, that Charlie Day meme where he has like the murder board. That's how I felt going through the news and trying to put it all together.
You know, for me, it was kind of funny just the process of covering this because I did not know this was coming. I don't know when, Stephanie, I don't know when you knew. You obviously were on top of it, and I don't know when you had the sort of advance word on it, but I was over the couple of days before Claude made this announcement, you're kind of getting reached out. These different companies are kind of reaching out saying, hey, we've got this new Claude MCP, and hey, we've got this new Claude MCP, and hey, we've got this announcement about working with Claude on access to justice. And everybody's like, but we can't talk about it until this certain time because it's all embargoed until this. And it's like, well, wait a minute. There seems to be something going on here that's not just coincidence. There seems to be a coordinated, series of events happening with regard to companies integrating with Claude. And
Yeah.
then I just kind of started prodding a little bit more. By the time I realized what was happening, I'd actually already written the main story I was planning to do, which was about both Thomson Reuters and Free Law Project, the sort
Yeah.
of legal research aspect, as you talked about. And then like more, there was really just that morning that I kind of got wind of what was actually finally coming up later in the day, and I kind of scrambled to try and get something written about that. But it was kind of interesting how they did this. They didn't just do it. They didn't just go into the legal market and say, okay, we're coming in with these connectors. I mean, they did this highly coordinated, basically media event in order to really make a big splash around it. And I thought that was an interesting approach to it.
It was shock and Claude.
Yes.
Love it. Love it.
That's a good one.
That's so good.
I wouldn't have known. Sorry, I wouldn't have known, Bob, that you didn't have the early advance notice. Your article was great. I can address slightly like how that went down. It was a very long process because there was back in February they were supposed to have an in-person event in New York, that I somehow got on the list for, and it was canceled because that's when we had a blizzard. And so they were like, oh, we can maybe let you talk to our people instead. And since February, it's been sort of delayed and like, oh, we're going to have another announcement maybe after that, maybe another, maybe, oh, and like it is like literally for 3 months, just me playing, email tag with their PR people, which is great. And then so eventually when this came around, they're like, okay, we finally have a big announcement we can share with you if you would agree to an embargo. But even then, it wasn't exactly how it wasn't the same as how we always usually deal with these. There was a little bit more, and we can address this like confusion about what was going on. Like initially, what I even said in my article about the TR involvement is based on what I was given, but that changed at the last minute and I wasn't given the change. So then I had to update my article. But so that's how I got the heads up in advance. And that's why I was, piecing this all together because there was a lot to unpack. And I mean, I got to talk to Mark Pike, who's a very nice guy, but you had like 20 minutes because he was fielding a million phone calls, so you couldn't really dive that deep into anything. But yeah, sorry, Steve, I cut you off and then rambled.
No, that's all right. I was just gonna, I was at the let's see, I can't say it was Quack, it is CGI. I was at CGI, as we pointed out in the notes, to have to say it correctly. The CGI, which is Global Institute, Global, whatever it is,
Clock Global.
when it happened. And frankly, I wasn't terribly surprised. I mean, I had predicted this, and I think several people had predicted this even before February. I remember it was back last year that the Harvey guys were interviewed on a podcast, and they weren't concerned about Claude. They were concerned about ChatGPT doing something like this. So it's definitely been on their radar. I really had to laugh, Stephanie, when you said, the rising tide floats all boats, and how this is going to help everybody. When I was practicing, there was a partner in the firm I was in who was the most aggressive proponent of getting origination credit for himself. And his argument always was, a rising tide floats all boats, guys, which is like, okay, but that's for me.
Yeah.
So I too take those statements with a real grain of salt.
Well, typically it's the really big boats that say that, right? It's usually
Right.
it's never like the little raft. It's always like, the warships that are like, usually I hate like the press releases that have like so much stuff in it, like, oh, there's this. But in this case, I thought it worked because it was kind of like, man, they got some heavy hitters like with them. I just reading it, I was like, even if it ends up, I mean, it is a big deal, but I mean, even if it ends up, somehow not being a big deal, just reading the names of all the players that they had lined up, like Harvey, Thomson Reuters, obviously discovery companies, even the access to justice companies and whatnot. it was really kind of overwhelming looking at it, just like, wow, all these companies are on board with these guys. Like you can't help but be impressed by that. And usually I don't like the whole like, those compounded like statements and whatnot. But in this case, I was like, wow, that was actually a very effective use because it's just looking at I got that Thanos thing. It's like, it's like they're inevitable now. Like it definitely works. So yeah, kudos to whoever drafted that press release. Maybe it was AI. Who knows?
Yeah, well, and it's kind of a shift from when they made their announcement in February of that first plugin, where Thomson Reuters stock tanked that day. LexisNexis or RELX, did they say Relics?
Relics? I don't know.
Relics stock tanked that day. Suddenly now all the major vendors are rushing to get in bed with Claude, basically, and they're not. It seemed like some legal tech vendors were viewing this as competition. Now suddenly they're viewing this as a necessary ally of some kind.
Right. Is it, I mean, you have to question is like they might still see it as competition, but it's better to be in bed with your competition than let them get ahead, right?
That's right. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
In a lot of ways, they can't really compete, so they probably don't have a lot of choice but to try to marry the
like I was
gorilla. Yeah.
trying to understand even how some of this works. So you've got an MCP connector from Claude to Harvey. Like if I'm in Claude, then what am I doing in Harvey via Claude? I don't even fully understand it.
Yeah, I don't
guess,
either.
but
That's where I come down. I mean, like I understand if you're in Claude, it just lets it, you have to have subscriptions to everything in case everyone's not clear on that. It's not like you suddenly have free Harvey
Right.
access if you didn't have a Harvey subscription, right? It's just sort of they're being with the MCP connectors, they're being the harness, they're being the orchestration layer, sort of, the one platform to make everything easy. And so you can access all these things if you've installed all the plugins or all the MCP connectors, just making it easier. And so, but not everything. All of this, I think we need to get into this too. Like an MCP connector to Harvey doesn't expose you to everything in Harvey. For example, you cannot access Harvey's partnership with LexisNexis and get Lexis content. That's not part of it. And with TR, you can access currently you can access co-counsel legal deep research workflows, but not directly into Westlaw or practical law, which I think was one of the biggest confusions that I even had originally. And I misreported it, misreported it based on what I was originally told in my defense, and then corrected it. So I get the orchestration aspect, the ease, another one of the things Anthropic keeps saying is, meet lawyers where they're already working, and that is kind of true. But then what I understand less is the benefit of if you have a platform and then if you have an established legal tech platform and you bring in Claude's plugins to that, I don't really know what that gets you as much. I have not dived into that side of it at all.
I mean, does it seem like what you get are, to use kind of like the Claude lingo, basically skills that are written by somebody else, which, has some value, but at a certain point, I can write my own skills. If I had anybody, if I had an IT department and was remotely smart about it.
I mean, the one I played around with was the Court Listener, the Free Law Project integration, and they set me up on that ahead of the actual release of the MCP. Well, you had to do a custom MCP connector to do that. But I mean, to me that was really fascinating. I mean, because you're now getting direct access through Claude into, it's not just basically bits and pieces of Court Listener. You're getting all of their case law, all of their docket data from Pacer, various other tools that they have, the ability to search across, their entire archive. I mean, it's an incredibly powerful legal research tool. And of course, Court Listener is entirely free. So, I mean, on one hand, the access to justice potential here is huge in terms of providing access to really robust legal research through Claude. And then even apart from access to justice, the ability to for even, maybe lawyers who don't have Westlaw or Harvey or LexisNexis to be able to do some really kind of sophisticated stuff. I mean, you can just kind of simply say, I know there's this litigation out there, find it for me on the docket and then set up alerts for me so I keep up to date on what's going on in that case. And it'll do it for you in a second. I know, the Describe people are in the chat. They're also beneficiaries of this. They've also set up MCP connectors, and so that's a really powerful, again, driver for legal research into their platform and their product. So it's a pretty, I mean, it's a really dramatic move, I think, in some respects in terms of access to law.
Oh yeah. Everything you just said is essentially the research article that I have like 85% written. Is that, I mean, you have to look at it two different ways. If you're big law with these, subscriptions, like it doesn't really add much. It gives you different ways to access it, an easier interface or whatever. It's not replacing those. It's not suddenly giving people access to Thomson Reuters stuff that they didn't have before, right? But if you're approaching this from A to J lands who never had any of these subscriptions to begin with, like you're not looking to replace any of that. Like you're looking like what you have now is a lot better than the nothing you really had before. And you have connectors to Free Law Project and Describe and Midpage. And even if those have prices attached, they're designed to be accessible, or very accessible and low prices. And so if you're somebody who is not as adept at like living in a Thomson Reuters or Alexis or something all day long, it gets that synthesis analysis layer on top of it from Claude is actually really useful. And I mean, you add Courtroom 5 in it, where you can look and see the procedures in your court, and you can just go basically from, here's my thing, how do I even do this? And I mean, you obviously have to have all the caveats that this is not replacing a lawyer or any of that, but it really, from the access to justice side, for the people that couldn't afford the big subscriptions before, or maybe like new Free Law Project Court Listener existed but didn't even really know how to search for stuff in it, it really does make a potentially huge difference here.
Well, and it's not just the access to justice. I mean, a lot of smaller law firms and maybe even large law firms might look at this and say, well, why am I paying all these subscription prices when we can do a lot of the same things with the Claude and the plugin? So it will have an impact, I think, on the big tech companies.
Yeah, I think that's where we're headed, right? And this is probably the beginning of that. Out of all of the announcements, I was interested in Courtroom 5, which we all, of course, right? We all know their work, and DocuSign. And DocuSign, what they wrote in the press release doesn't sound too exciting, but as we all know, DocuSign is a huge, piece of the workflow when it comes to legal work. And so it just goes to those comments that you just made, Steve, about how, for the access to justice perspective, like anything is better than nothing. And we know they're not getting access to these tools. But in terms of that huge market of small to medium-sized firms, right, who can't afford the enterprise models, the big firms can already do that. And then the idea of having to navigate which platform and plugin to do this brings the barriers to entry much lower. And I think it's going to be very much like you said when we had ChatGPT 4 come out. We didn't know how the market was going to respond and how consumers were going to respond. So I'm really curious how the legal consumer, both on the public side and like those small, medium-sized law firms, are going to respond to this. With Harvey and Thomson Reuters, like I think that's a whole other conversation, to be honest. I think that's a whole other conversation. But like for those A to J, those lower barriers to entry points, I'm curious in the next few months, like what decisions people are going to make. Because I do think there's a firm out there that's going to say, you know what, instead of going for that other thing we were looking at that we were going to invest in, let's try this first. Let's see how this goes.
Well, but I mean, and we talked about this in the show where it's like, firms, I mean, especially the bigger ones, like they can buy multiple tools, not just paying one or two. I mean, they can they can pretty much buy whatever they want. I mean, within reason, obviously, but like I thought like so for me, like, and we haven't even mentioned the Microsoft thing yet. I mean, because that wasn't a huge part of the announcement, but it was there. And if they're fully integrated with the Microsoft suite of products now, that's another big thing. Because I mean, I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but I'm pretty certain that a vast majority of lawyers and law firms are still on Office. And
Oh yeah.
they're not using Mac products necessarily. They're not using Google products, except maybe one or two products. But I would guess like the vast majority of them are still on the Microsoft suite. So, if this, I mean, if this is going to be so convenient for people to use, like just go into Outlook and, or go into Word and then access it, then that's going to be a huge advantage for them.
Yeah, there's so much here. Like we haven't talked about the Microsoft part. We haven't really talked about the practice area plugins. We've been focusing on the MCP connectors. And buried in all of this was this whole developer platform thing too, the Claude platform where they're going to have, you can have these managed agents on it. And it's like that's developing. The four of the practice area plugins come with these basically they're calling them like cookbooks that you can embed into the managed agents in the Claude platform. And so you can sort of build your own tools out of stuff, and their partners can build tools on there and share them. And I mean, there's just so much involved in this announcement that it's like nearly impossible to keep track of. And I tried in one article. I was like pushing 5,000 words at one point, and I was like, Stephanie, you have to stop.
Yeah, but I go back again to I do think it's brilliant for them to do it
Mhm.
all at once.
Oh yeah, I agree.
I do think this has been really effective, but just to quickly go back to the Microsoft point, someone has made a great comment in the chat about how ChatGPT has been chasing Microsoft plugins. I actually see this as opposite. I think Claude is actually trying to catch up to OpenAI. That's why I like that they're doing this all together. I'm not saying it's not a big deal that it's in Outlook and Word. We could also talk about that, in the workflows. But ChatGPT has been chasing after that, not so much maybe purely focused on legal, but like that integration with Microsoft. So I do think Claude is trying to do two things at once, trying to catch up to what OpenAI has been trying to do, and at the same time say, no, we're the first choice if you're at a law firm thinking about integration of Gen AI and Microsoft.
It's an interesting observation that the announcement came out on the opening day of the Clock conference, for which DocuSign was a huge sponsor, by the way, and sponsored at least one and maybe two keynotes. And yet there was very little talk about it in the exhibit hall between people. DocuSign CEO or executive officer that introduced the keynote, he didn't even mention it. Or maybe he didn't. I wasn't listening, but I was really sort of waiting to hear a lot of talk about it. I don't know what that means, but it was just kind of interesting that it seemed like, okay, yeah, another announcement, big deal.
And it does seem like a lot of if you look at the plugins and the tools, I mean, aside from, well, legal research is still relevant, but like they are more in-house focused. I don't know if anyone was on their webinar today that happened because they had another webinar, but like, yes, they have litigation workflows and obviously these are going to be used by that, but I do tend more heavily currently transactional, whether that's law firm or, in-house. So, I mean, I think it's very relevant for that audience.
I think what we talked a little bit before about what this means for all the other vendors in the legal tech world, and again, just from having played around just on this court listener MCP, it did have me thinking about that because we keep hearing from Thomson Reuters and from LexisNexis that their moat is their access to quality content, and that their AI is playing off of that quality content. But Court Listener has quality content. I mean, it has actual case law, it has actual docket information, it has oral argument, audio and transcripts from federal appellate courts. I mean, it's got troves of direct first level legal information. And now you layer Claude onto that, does that whole, does that moat begin to dry up in terms of what the big legal AI providers are claiming differentiates them?
Yeah, I think the Free Law Project one is a court listener is a particularly interesting MCP connector because, like, yes, they have tons and tons of data. What has always sort of been a limitation is, the ability to search across it and those kind of things. And now, kind of, Claude essentially gives you that ability secondhand. Because if you go to Claude and is like, I need a case about this, it will somehow search through it for you in a way that you really couldn't. So I think that's a huge boon and they are free, so it's not like it's a money moat for them. Yeah.
I guess the remaining moat that the Thomson Reuters or LexisNexis has is the sort of the confidentiality privilege argument, which I think their claim is that whatever you put in our platform remains confidential. You don't have to worry about breaching any privilege or anything like that. It's all safe and sound. How robust that is, I don't know, but that is their argument.
Right.
Yeah.
That's true.
So, but there's a lot of things that you can do research wise that you don't necessarily have to breach any privilege, to get information. I mean, you might have to take that information and massage it into the relevant facts of your case and all of that, but it's still better. Like we've all said, it's better than nothing.
And I think the privilege point is one of their weakest. I don't think they're really prepared to address it. I mean, because every time, like I asked and people ask in the webinar every time, and they're always like, we're confident that people can use our tools. And I'm like, okay, that doesn't really mean anything. And so I do think that is I mean, until privilege case law is settled in this area, which is far from being so, I think that is one of their weakest areas that they need to, get better messaging around and make that more clear to people.
Yeah, and even with the legal, but I guess and with the legal tech providers and their privilege argument, I mean, all you have is their assurance, really. I mean, I think. I mean, they say don't worry, his privilege is confidential. We have all the agreements in place. That's your assurance, and of course, Claude and Anthropic can't provide that, or maybe someday that they will. But so
I mean, you're right. But the three big cases we've had so far that even touch on the privilege question, they're not looking at legal tech tools. They're looking at, ChatGPT and Claude and whatever about
right.
privilege.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is I'm just thinking of the article that I wrote that we didn't talk about last week. Where where this
Early
is how
this week.
Yeah, so
that happened to several of us, I think.
I feel like there was more than one person that happened to.
We
That
talked
must have been
about
what
it.
Victor was moderating.
No. We talked about it.
That wasn't me. In the words of Shaggy, it wasn't me.
Oh, sure.
It wasn't me.
Hey. No, we
You guys
talked
got me
about
on
it
camera, but it wasn't me.
We talked about it in the first 20 minutes.
That's right.
Okay, so I was just fashionably like, got it. Yeah, I bring it up because in the article I mentioned, of course, Microsoft giving their testimony in Senate in France, where they talked about privileged information, and that has led to a movement to several countries internationally looking at this from a national security perspective. So long story short of this is I do think this idea of privileged information is going to be a marketing selling point for the long run because as my article was pointing out, this is now becoming not just a like attorney-client privilege, but like it's just becoming an even bigger issue in terms of national security, personal data protection, all those kind of things that consumers and other people are more heightened aware of than they were a few years ago. So until folks like Anthropic and OpenAI can really answer this in a definitive way, I think the legal tech companies are still going to have an edge on this. Do I think they will always have an edge on this? No, to be honest. But for now, since we don't have clear case law or legislation, I do think that is going to be one of the things that keeps some companies going.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You can talk about your story now if you want.
My last is I'm curious to see going forward what other I can only assume they're going to add more MCP connectors, and I've kind of heard, at least on like the Access Just side thing too, like they were just like people who just like didn't get their stuff together in time, kind of, and are still in the process. But so yeah, who knows? I'm curious to see who else falls in line in terms of being an MCP connector, because I think it's eventually going to be one of those. If this takes off at all, which I have no reason to think it will not take off, um, I think it's going to become one of those, are you or aren't you?
It'll be interesting to see what OpenAI does as well in sort of response, whether they step up to the plate, although I think their CEO has been a bit distracted of late with having to face cross-examination in a courtroom, and apparently he didn't do very well based on the articles that I've read.
No, he did not. Yeah, he might be a little busy. Yeah, this is again why I think this whole thing is so brilliant. I think Claude is really saying, no, we're the ones you want to come to for legal. Like the MCP alone, that alone would have been a big deal. Like
Yeah.
there's just so much other things involved. I like that question. Do we think that this is going to be a thing where it's like, oh, you don't have an MCP like that, because is it going to be like kind of synonymous with like what you're not using Gen AI? I'm kind of curious about that because I see in the chat some people were like, this is like when iPhone, launched their app store. I don't know if I mean, it could be that big, but and if ChatGPT responds, I think that's still an if because I think OpenAI has a different strategy for legal. I don't know if they're going to chase us the way Claude is doing all of this but I could be wrong.
But I also think
I
a
mean,
big portion of the disruptor potential comes in how much are, law firms and legal departments leaning into using Claude to access these tools. If you see a lot more usage via the Claude platform versus we're going to stick to our guns and use the standalone, even though you need the subscription to access both ways, that's going to incentivize people to be like, oh, well, it's back when it's a more enhanced version of like, oh, well, we don't integrate with anything. Well, then we're not going to use you,
For
yeah,
years,
and
it was
ChatGPT
whether lawyers.
sorry.
Go ahead.
So, and ChatGPT does have an advantage of like name recognition, at least with like the general public, right? Because I mean, most people still associate, for better or worse, like, oh, I'll ChatGPT it, or I'll ask ChatGPT, or I'll just do that. It's will that still be the case in a couple of years? I don't know, but I don't think Claude has anywhere near that type of name recognition with the general population. With legal, it's completely different. But I mean, with people without JDs and without law backgrounds and whatnot, I think ChatGPT still has a pretty big lead. But again, this could easily cut into it. We'll see.
I was going to
Yeah,
say that the issue for years was whether lawyers would move to the cloud. Now it's whether they will move to the Claude.
Oh,
Lord.
That's very
really
lovely.
good. I like that.
Too bad Nikki's not here.
I
She
was
could
going
write.
to
She could
say
write a whole
something,
book
but I'm
about
speechless. I'm just overwhelmed in awe.
Well, and to echo the comment, from Daniela, Claude or Anthropic is definitely trying to position itself as less evil.
There was the
And
interesting though
what-
in Claude's press release, didn't they say something about the fact that the most significant users of
Oh yeah.
Claude Cowork were lawyers or something like that?
Yeah, number one power users of Claude Cowork, apparently three. I didn't see the thing that said three times everyone else, but I've seen that thrown around. But yeah, lawyers have become the number one power user of Claude
Yeah.
Cowork.
I mean, that's
Well,
really interesting.
one of the things when we talk about this, we often talk about it in terms of, big law firms or defense law firms, but and I don't have any statistical evidence, but a lot of defense lawyers that I've talked to recently have remarked upon the dramatic increase in usage by plaintiffs' lawyers, contingency lawyers, in not the Thomson Reuters or the LexisNexis products, but these inexpensive products like Claude and ChatGPT. So, and I do know that at least in one jurisdiction, there have been a record number of plaintiffs' lawsuits filed, uh, which which would suggest that they're using these tools to handle matters cheaply on a contingency fee basis. So cases that it would make no sense for them to take before, they can now take and make a profit on it. And that's not bad. I'm not being suggesting it's evil by any means. Probably it's a good thing, but but this may hasten the plaintiffs lawyer group to use the Claude tool even more than what they're doing now.
Yeah. Julie, should we talk more about your story? Or
Well, Joe said you
we
guys
were going
talked
to
about
talk.
it
We
last
didn't
week.
get to it. Well, I know, but you weren't there for it, so it's not the same.
That's okay. I mean, it's like a finders keepers, losers weepers kind of thing because I was so
No,
late.
we didn't really talk about it before last week. Joe was pulling your leg.
No, that's okay. So last week, yep, I
Was
published.
it last week? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know when
Yeah.
these things
I
come
lose.
out.
I know. I lose track.
Yeah, and it was republished again with in that Walrus magazine. And basically in Canada we've been talking about national sovereignty and everything, and they're like, oh, whatever. And the headline is awesome. It says, oh no, your data is already there. Everyone already has your data. So the article talks about how whether countries should be taking a specific approach to developing their own technology and infrastructure in order to keep their data safe and in order to keep the quality of data as well. And that conversation to me kind of translates to law firms and in-house and all these other legal departments, because while the article itself talks about different countries and their approaches to national sovereignty and data protection and all these other big, wonderful information governance issues, it also talks about the realities of all these platforms being easy to use, that everyone's familiar with, and they're all US based, while at the same time having fuzzy wuzzy regulatory and legal things. So basically, you have to make hard decisions long term. And I feel like there's a beautiful analogy to lawyers always also having to make hard decisions long term, because I've got people saying Canada should be building its own tools and other people saying that's not really realistic. And it reminds me of the conversations we had years ago of law firms, maybe they should create their own tools, or, maybe just adopting what's already out there. So that's a very quick way to explain some very complex things in there. But yeah, that was my article, and I thought it was just an interesting way to think about how we deal with these issues, because unfortunately, while the technology is shifting so quickly, our regulation and our laws are also not shifting quickly at the same time. So I do understand why, for all of these legal consumers who are trying to make decisions of what to use and when to use it and how to use it, can be really complicated, because you don't always have the authority saying, yeah, for sure, we know that's 100%, or it's not 100%.
Someone in Canada should start a law practice management company in the
Agreed.
cloud.
I agree. So if you've got
And
somebody
they could,
who's got
and they,
$10 million, I'll get started on that right away.
and if they did that, they could probably end up sponsoring a hockey team as well.
They could do that.
Oh, I like Steve's idea about the hockey team sponsor.
They're not a very good team though, right? I mean, they've had some pretty rough years ever since that sponsorship went. I'm not saying that Clio caused the Vancouver Canucks to go belly up, but
I mean, it's not just a sponsorship,
Joshua Lennon,
it's
what
on the
say you?
jerseys, which is really cool.
That was pretty cool.
no, it is a pretty cool. It's a cool and I mean, just looking at the deck of that. I mean, I wasn't able to read the story in depth, but a lack of political will standing in the way. I'm like, see, it's nice to see that it's not just America that has political issues when it comes to technology and figuring out how to move forward. It's good to know that we're not the only ones here that don't know what we're doing.
Don't, yeah, but don't try to compare everyone to us.
All right. Well, there were actually a couple of other stories this week as well. The one I think is just kind of worth touching. I don't know if we have to spend a lot of time on it, but NetDocuments had news this week of its what did it even? It's I don't have it in front of me here. It's legal context graph and unveiling its legal context graph to map legal knowledge, as well as rolling out a whole new platform. My desk is not firmly suited in my new office here, and it keeps bouncing all over the place. But I thought that I actually thought that was a pretty interesting story. I only had a chance to cover it somewhat briefly this week, but I think it kind of plays into this whole idea that, for years when NetDocuments started, when iManage started, when others started, WorldDocs back in the day, we thought of document management systems as these sort of static repositories of documents. And more we are coming to think of DMSs as really more of these, knowledge bases, essentially, that all of the documentation that a firm owns is essentially reflective of all of its knowledge, and more than its knowledge, its relationships and the matters it handles and the timelines of its work and the work product and all of that. And along as generative AI has evolved, I think the ability to kind of graph that, to map that, has become more and more critical. And so I think what NetDocuments announced this week is kind of a major step toward taking their database from, again, the sort of static document repository to something that is more like a dynamic, a dynamic knowledge management system or something along those lines. But so I think it's worthy of note. Unfortunately, any news that fell this week all got kind of muffled by the Claude news. But I don't know. Anybody else look at that or have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I looked at it. Of course, I saw I think the same demo that you saw and maybe others. So I was pretty impressed with what they were doing. And, a lot of that knowledge base within law firms is really important because it sort of defines how, particularly a very large firm, how they do things. This is the way this firm answers interrogatories, or this is the way this firm handles experts or witnesses or what have you. And you could argue whether that's really true or not true, and that's certainly a legitimate debate. But not being able to access the information to define that in some way, makes it impossible. And when I was practicing, it was before any of this kind of recovery was available. It was always sort of, I know we had a case like that, and I know I filed something like that. It's in such and such a file someplace, and it was always a mess. And there was nothing more frustrating than to know something was there that could be of such great value and not being able to access it. So yeah, Bob, I was pretty impressed by what they did, and it's not surprising because most of the stuff they do is impressive.
All right. Obviously, everybody else is pretty excited about it as well. Speechlessly
I felt
excited.
so bad every time I got PR from any other company because I knew this was coming. I was like, sorry, can't.
Yeah, it was a bad week. All right. Well, we do have one other AI controversy story this week, I guess. And Victor, you've got a report on that one.
Yeah, here, let me try to get the link real quickly. Yeah, basically,
I can drop the link if you don't have it.
okay, thanks. Yeah, there's a bit of a kerfuffle that's not really a Supreme Court term, I guess. There was so Neal Katyal, who's one of the leading Supreme Court advocates of this era, obviously a very intelligent guy, and whatnot. He caused a stir this week because he gave a TED talk in which he attributed his recent win in front of the Supreme Court to using an AI, he called it a bespoke AI program that helped predict what the justice would ask him and whatnot. And some people went, it ruffled some feathers. People were like, oh, in addition to just using the AI aspect of it, they were like, oh, it overstates his his impact as an advocate and blah blah blah. And yeah, I do kind of see the point of that. I mean, I think a lot of times the justices already have their minds made up before they even get into the get into the court. I mean, I don't know of too many arguments that have necessarily swayed and swayed justices, and if they have, they haven't said it. But look, if this helped him prepare and made him feel more confident and whatnot before heading up to the podium, and even for someone as accomplished as him, who's argued so many important cases and whatnot, if he felt like this gave him an edge, then hey, why wouldn't everybody use it?
He didn't only thank Harvey. He also thanked like his life coach and like a couple other people.
Yeah.
It was like, I don't remember what they were, but it was like 4 things.
Meditation coach.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm just like, I really enjoyed the video. I will admit it, but yeah.
His
that's
improv.
important. Shout out to the meditation coach. When I saw this, I was like, why is this a controversy? Genuinely, I was just like, are people, what is it that people are actually upset about? That he admitted to using AI?
I think so.
That he credited AI as part of the reason why he won? And again, going to Victor's points about by the time you get to oral arguments at the Supreme Court, right? So like, I was trying to figure out what's the thing that people are upset about, because I also thought the speech was really cute. So I don't know. I'm like,
with you,
hey,
Julie, totally.
He was nice. It was nice.
I think more people are mad about the people are upset about the claiming that he had a role like that. This was a major upset, basically, which I don't think is necessarily fair. But I think there's some sour grapes among some people about like anybody claiming that they convinced the justices, whatever. But the Harvey point, I mean, I mentioned this briefly last week on the show. I said, do we think this makes us more impressed with Harvey or less impressed with the Supreme Court, that it was able to predict everyone's questions so verbatim, as Neal said? And to some extent, it's a little bit of both, I think. Like the fact that it probably is, AI probably could, if given a bunch of oral arguments, come up with some pretty good guesses as to what everybody's going to ask. It might struggle with Thomas, since Thomas spent 20 years not asking a question. But the rest of them have a series of questions that is pretty good. Katyal prepares pretty robustly. I've talked with him about his preparation process in the past, before AI, and it doesn't shock me that the fact that there's a new tool that exists is something he would just add on top of that process. I don't think it replaced a bunch of the pre-existing work that he was doing. And yeah, like he just brought a new thing in. I will say that he gets a lot of flack for the thanking his improv coach. He actually talks a lot, like he really believes in the improv stuff. He thinks that is a huge part of his ability to kind of turn on a dime in the training he's got, especially because, like, let's be honest, the rule of improv is yes and, right? That you don't generally tell the justices no. You say, oh, your insane comment, yes, and so I guess it works out.
Well, I totally see how that would be useful. Not just the yes and, but also just being willing, like being able to adjust and pivot. And yeah, I didn't think that was weird, but I like the whole video, so here we are.
Yeah. I don't know how many people here have actually taken improv. I've had the pleasure of doing that as somebody who had to take speech classes throughout my childhood because I'm a very shy person, shocker. But yeah, I agree. Like improv is awesome for a variety of reasons, and I can see why somebody who is a litigator wanting to, take improv classes to improve. Again, this is why I'm like, this is a nothing burger. Because unless you've had the joy of actually taking improv, like you will see now I'm just promoting improv now, but it really is good. It really teaches you how to think on your toes. It's very funny, helps you to get out of yourself, out of your mind, right? It, like, be in the moment, all the kind of things. But like I feel like, yeah, AI, of course, AI would be able to predict people's questions in the same way AI would be able to predict questions in a job interview, in the same way AI would be able to predict questions from a reporter. Like I remember talking to legal tech developers who were like, we're working on predictive coding for Supreme Court cases and, oral arguments and all of that. Like this to me is like, yes, obviously, because that's a huge data set and it's right there. I don't think maybe this is us culturally like just getting used to this idea. But like I to me it's a very like obvious natural conclusion.
It's very
And
cool. I mean, I was very impressed with the technology. I mean, I've argued a few appellate cases in my day, and to have had the ability to go in and have some certainty about what questions I was going to get asked, and to suggest even the phrasing of the questions, would have made it a whole lot easier, I think, to go in and feel like I was really prepared for what was going to come up. Because so much of it is just not just this fear that you're not prepared for the question. This question's going to come up that you're not prepared for. That's what the biggest fear of oral argument, I think.
Oh yeah, I
Well,
mean,
and
I call them the court
I
in
was
law
just sitting.
school, which is a lot like the Supreme Court and Neal Katyal. But yeah, I totally get it.
I was just sitting here thinking, there's a sort of a fairness arm to it as well, because in the past, if you came from a large law firm where you had several partners who had actually argued before the Supreme Court, that you could tap into to predict what kind of questions, that was a big advantage. And if you were with a firm that didn't, you wouldn't get the same opportunity. This is just a way to sort of level the playing field a bit.
We use CGI in two different contexts over the course of this show.
I mean,
CGI.
I didn't realize
that-
it was such a thing.
There was
that's the
improv
thing.
at CGI.
It can't work. We can never make CGI happen because CGI means something else, like that we
Exactly.
all know, right? Like we all
Exactly.
know.
like
Yeah.
why are we trying to what
Ah.
no, it's a no. It's just a no. Stop.
And my comment was a Mean Girls reference for anyone who didn't understand
Yes,
that.
we got it. Yeah,
I
we got
would
it, yeah.
love to hear what happened at CGI and or clock, whatever you want to call it.
Well, Steve's our ambassador.
Says, unfortunately, once again, we're out of time. So we'll have to wait with bated breath for next week's show when you find out about what happened at Clock. In the meantime, I did write a couple of 3 articles about it, so they'll probably be published by that time as well. And I say that it was a really well done show. The legal ops people, it's broader than technology. It's not totally technology focused. They're very serious about what they do. I really had the sense that they were, most of them were there not for the parties, but for the content. Not to say, there were parties, but wasn't as sort of, tech bro kind of stuff that went on. It was a serious conference for serious people, and I was frankly, I'm always impressed when I go, but this year I thought it was really well done. So one thing that I did think was interesting, it's always been in Las Vegas. This year they moved it to Chicago, McCormick, and I was wondering whether there would be a big hue and cry, and most of the people I talked to were really happy that they did. Under the theory that Chicago is easier to get to, and they weren't all that enamored with Las Vegas anyway. So there may have been a lot of complaints, but I didn't hear them in the show floor or anything else. So
I was going to say party wise, McCormick Place is no Vegas, but I did also hear last year at Clock that part of the reason they were seeing dips in attendance was not just because people didn't want to travel to the States, but also because as travel was being more scrutinized, people companies would see Vegas on the list and be like, that's just a boondoggle. That's
yeah, I
real.
heard that.
And then of course, McCormick Place, nobody goes there willingly.
Yeah.
Stephanie, you say that having not been there during Comic-Con.
I know. I used to this Comic-Con.
Yeah.
All right. Anyway, we are out of time, but we'll be back next week and talk about whatever else gets dropped on us at the last minute in the news, and hopefully have some discussions and maybe catch up on a few weeks of Steve's stories as well. So.
Julie can come early, and Julie and Steve can just
Yes.
run.
Yes.
We can
We'll
have
come early.
our own show.
We'll do a
Pretty much,
pre-show.
Steve. It'll just be me asking AI generated questions for half an hour about your article. There you go.
it's like the red carpet special before the real show. They're gonna host like at 2:30 Eastern. Everybody, Steve and Julie are gonna go through all their stories.
Who is Steve wearing this week?
We're getting AI Joan Rivers. It'll be great.
Well, if we tell Julie 2:30, she'll be here at 3. So.
Yeah, that's true. That's really true. No, that's okay.
Oh,
We're all friends now. I can say it.
That's true. No, that's
All
okay.
right.
You can go back to the Claudosaurus. Sorry,
Claudezilla. All right,
Claudzilla.
All right.
Sorry, I
All
knew.
right.
get out of here.
There,
All right. See ya.
Bye.